It was the tail end of October when Nora Fletcher rode west with a trunk full of canned peaches and a heart heavy as river stone. Her late husband's land deed flapped loose in her coat pocket, corners soft from months of folding and unfolding, like she was still trying to read a different fate from the same old paper. The wagon wheels sang their tired song along the rutted path, and behind her, the world she knew shrank into fog and memory. Montana had sounded like a promise when she first saw the word written in his coarse hand, on that scrap of a letter sent from a silver camp, years before the fever took him. He'd never made it back to claim the parcel, too much work, too little luck, but Nora had nothing left tethering her to Missouri, so she came, alone but not rootless, not yet. She arrived under a sky the color of worn denim, with snow threatening in the high places and the creek whispering frost at its edges. The cabin, such as it was, leaned like a drunkard against the hillside. Half-rotted shingles, a door that hung open on one hinge, and a porch that had surrendered to gravity. But it was hers now, or his, or maybe theirs, in the brief overlap of memory and inheritance. The first night she burned cotton rags in the stove just to chase the damp from the walls. Sat wrapped in a quilt with her boots still on, gun across her knees, listening to wolves test the edge of the dark. She didn't cry. Nora Fletcher did not cry. She stitched patches by lantern light and made a list of what needed fixing. In the morning, she'd start with the roof. He came down from the ridgeline 3 days later, leading a mule with a limp and carrying a brace of snowshoe hares. His name was Eli Booker. She learned that much from the hard stamp of it on the side of his trapper's bag. Tall, bearded, quiet. Wore silence the way other men wore pride. He didn't startle when he saw her chopping wood behind the cabin, only offered a nod and a half-smile like he'd expected her all along. "You're on Holly's land," he said after a long pause. "It's Fletcher land now," she replied. Another nod, slower this time. Approval or caution, she couldn't tell. "Stove works?" he asked. "Barely, leaks smoke." "I can fix it." And he did. Mended the stovepipe and shored up the porch with lengths of pine he hauled down himself. Didn't ask what she was doing out here alone. Didn't pry when she limped after hammering her own thumb. They shared coffee once the fire took, strong and burnt tasting in tin cups, the kind that scalds your tongue and settles into your bones. He came by again the next week, then the week after that. Always with something in hand, a coil of rabbit snares, a slab of venison, oil for her lantern. Always on foot, even when the snow came in earnest and the world shrank to the hush of white. He brought word from the nearest town, 16 miles off, and stories he never quite finished telling. She learned to read between the lines, a brother lost to whiskey, a war that had scraped the marrow from his spirit, a woman left behind in Kansas. They didn't talk about forever. Neither of them had any business with that word, but they stacked firewood together under the lean-to, hands brushing in the cold. They sat long by the fire, the crackle and pop filling in the silence they didn't need to break. When she fell sick come January, he stayed 3 nights straight, feeding her spoonfuls of broth and keeping the stove lit even when his own eyes sagged from lack of sleep. Nora didn't believe in rescue. She buried too much to count on anything enduring, but Eli didn't rescue. He simply remained, like snow, like time. By February, her hands stopped shaking when she lit the stove in the morning. By March, the cabin no longer leaned so heavy to one side. And by April, she found herself listening not for wolves at night, but for the sound of his boots on the porch. They didn't speak of what they were building, only of what needed mending. And in the hush of their quiet labor, something old and kind took root, not love, not yet, but the kindling of it. The thaw came slowly, as if the land didn't quite trust spring to stay. Ice clung to the north faces of trees well into April, and the creek ran dark and swollen, carrying bits of broken branch and last year's sorrow. Nora took to walking each morning with a tin pail in hand, collecting the last of the winter sap from the sugar maples and checking for signs of bear along the ridge trail. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned not to wait for help. Eli came less often now that the worst of the cold had passed, but when he did, he stayed longer. He brought his tools and a stubborn patience, fixing the warped cellar door, repairing the split yoke on her water pails. Once, he showed up with a pair of hand-stitched gloves, left them folded on her stoop without a word. They fit too well to be a guess. They shared meals sometimes, biscuits, fried trout, beans cooked slow with pork rind. He never came empty-handed, never stayed the night. Nora didn't ask him to. But she started keeping 2 mugs clean on the shelf, 2 spoons beside the tin plate. One Sunday, under a sky strung with low gray clouds, he brought her a small pine rocking chair. It was rough-built and uneven, but solid. She looked at it like it might vanish if she touched it. "Found the frame up near Alder Gulch," he said, shifting on his heels. "Cleaned it up, figured you'd like to sit while you mend." She sat, it didn't creak. He nodded once and went back to the fence post he was replacing. Later, after he'd gone, she ran her fingers along the joints. They were clumsy, sure, but they held, and something inside her, something tight and wary, eased a little. The days lengthened. Snow became mud, and mud gave way to shoots of green and the start of wild lupin along the banks. Nora planted root vegetables in crooked rows behind the cabin, singing under her breath like she used to on her father's farm, before the years turned heavy. She didn't notice Eli watching from the tree line until she stood to stretch. "You sing," he said, stepping into the clearing. Not a question, more a discovery. "Only when I forget someone's listening." He gave her that half-smile again, the one that never quite reached both corners of his mouth. She offered him the spade. He took it, dug beside her in silence. That evening they drank coffee while the fire caught. He whittled something small in the circle of light, she couldn't see what, and she watched his hands, how sure they were, how gentle. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke and sap. A kind of peace settled between them, unspoken and durable as the chair by her hearth. She didn't ask where he went at night, didn't wonder aloud about the life he kept just out of reach. Whatever had come before had scarred him, same as her, and scars didn't need explaining. They only needed room. One night in May, lightning cracked the sky wide open. Thunder rolled like the earth groaning in its sleep. The wind snapped branches and lashed the walls with rain hard enough to drown the fire. Nora sat wrapped in quilts, candle guttering, the memory of too many storms crowding her breath. A knock came just before midnight. Eli stood on the threshold, soaked to the skin, mule tied to the porch rail. He didn't ask to come in. She stepped aside. He shrugged off his coat, steam rising from his shoulders, and stood by the stove without a word. She brought him coffee. The candle flickered between them. Outside, the world howled. "You could have stayed wherever you sleep," she said. "Didn't feel right," he said. She nodded. He didn't leave that night, didn't touch her, didn't ask for anything. Just lay on the floor wrapped in a horse blanket, eyes on the rafters, while she listened to the storm ease its grip on the cabin walls. In the quiet hours before dawn, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, but she knew he'd heard. When morning came, he made the coffee. She chopped kindling. The sky was clean again, and the mountains wore new snow like old crowns. They didn't speak of what had passed between them, didn't name it. But she poured him a second cup without asking, and he stayed to watch the sun rise. The mule died sometime in late June, its legs giving out in the heat that pressed down like a wet quilt. Eli buried it behind the cabin, where the ground was soft and shaded by spruce, and marked the spot with a pile of stones. Nora stood nearby, her hands clenched around a tin dipper, saying nothing. There was a quiet grief in him that day, deeper than she'd seen before, like the earth had taken more than a beast from him. Afterward, he sat on the back step, palms black with soil, and stared off at the hills. She brought him a peach from her last jar, split it in half and placed the fruit in his open hand. He didn't thank her, didn't need to. They ate in silence, juice sticky on their fingers, the world turning gold around them. Without the mule, Eli began sleeping on her porch some nights, a blanket rolled beneath his head, rifle across his chest. Nora let it be. They didn't name the shift, didn't make declarations. That wasn't their way. He still disappeared sometimes, off to his traplines or a distant ridge, but the returns came quicker, the absences shorter. She began to leave bread cooling on the sill and boots beside the door, just in case. That summer they built a smokehouse, hauled logs from a deadfall 1/2 mile up, stacked and notched them side by side until a squat little structure stood just east of the cabin. Eli worked shirtless in the heat, his back a tapestry of old scars and sunburn. Nora never asked about them. She only handed him water and kept pace beside him, hammering nails with calloused hands. They fought once in August. Over the henhouse of all things. He said it needed a new beam. She said the old one would hold. He raised his voice. She slammed the door. It wasn't the words that stung but the sharpness in them, like forgetting for a moment how carefully they'd learned to tread around each other's broken places. He came back the next morning with a new beam and an apology carved into the wood itself. Didn't mean it. She helped him install it without a word, and that night she set an extra log on the fire and poured him the last of her good whiskey. September brought elk, and with it, days of work. They butchered together in the open air, the clean sound of blades and the scent of blood in the grass. Nora tied strips for drying, Eli packed salt into the hides. They moved like parts of the same engine, seamless, quiet. He told her without prompting about his brother's last winter. A frozen river, a broken leg, 3 days without fire. Nora didn't speak until he was finished. Then she handed him a bowl of stew and rested her hand briefly on his forearm. "You're not him," she said. "I know. But you still carry him." "I do." That was all. October rolled in on the back of a sharp wind, and Nora felt the old ache in her hip like a prophecy. She harvested the last of the carrots, smoked what meat they hadn't eaten, packed shelves with root vegetables and jars of boiled-down apples. Eli started mending traps inside, a low rhythm of metal and rasp echoing through the cabin in the evenings. He'd taken to staying more nights than not, rolling his bed near the hearth, sharing chores, fetching water. It wasn't spoken. It just became true. One morning, before first light, she found him outside stacking wood. Frost clung to his beard, breath curling like smoke. He looked up when she stepped out, eyes dark and steady. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said. He considered her a long moment. "I know." "Then why do you?" He didn't smile. "Just said because I want to." She looked at the sky then, streaked with the first hints of dawn, and thought of all the things she had never asked for and all the things that had come anyway. That night, for the first time, he lay beside her in the narrow bed. No words, no invitation, just warmth, steady and solid. She turned her face into his shoulder, felt the slow beat of something enduring. They didn't speak of love. They didn't need to. It was there in the firewood stacked high, in the coffee brewed before sunrise, in the weight of his hand on hers when the cold crept back. It was not the forever they'd once doubted, but it was a beginning. Snow came early that year, lacing the trees in silence by the first week of October. Nora woke to a sky the color of ash and the distant crackle of ice shifting across the river bend. The world had gone still overnight, as if holding its breath. She reached for the firewood with one hand, Eli's warmth still lingering in the blankets behind her. He stirred as she fed the stove, the quiet rustle of his breath folding into the morning hush. No words passed between them. They didn't need ceremony in the dawn. He rose, shrugged into his shirt, and lit the coffee pot. It was the shape of their days now, small tasks shared, movements mapped to each other without thought. They'd taken to reading in the evenings, her voice tracing the old words aloud while he carved small shapes from driftwood. He never asked for books, but listened like they were church hymns, eyes soft with a kind of reverence. When she finished one, he'd nod once and say, "Start another." By mid-November, the snows deepened and Eli went out less. Traps waited under feet of powder. Instead, he turned to repairs, rechinking the cabin walls, oiling hinges, reinforcing the roof beams with salvaged boards. Nora watched him from the window, snowflakes catching in his beard, his breath turning the air silver. One evening, he brought in a wrapped bundle, laid it on the table and stood back. "For you," he said. She peeled the cloth away to find a spindle, carved smooth and balanced. The wood still smelled faintly of pine. "I know you talked once about spinning," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Her fingers curled around the polished shaft. "I haven't done it in years. Thought you might want to try again." She blinked down at the gift, at the quiet thoughtfulness of it, then reached up and touched his cheek just once. "Thank you." The gesture startled them both. December came with fierce storms. A blizzard rolled down from the bitterroots and trapped them for 4 days. They rationed wood, kept to one room, wrapped themselves in quilts like children. The cabin groaned beneath the wind, and they huddled close, the fire casting flickering gold across the ceiling. He read aloud to her then, voice low and rough, the words halting but sincere. On the third night, the chimney backed up. Smoke thickened in the room, and Nora coughed until her ribs ached. Eli opened the door with effort, let the storm bite into the space while he cleared the flue from outside. When he came back in, his face was raw with cold, lashes crusted with ice. She pressed a warm cloth to his hands, silent but firm, then wrapped his fingers in her own. "You didn't have to go out there," she said. "I did." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. She saw it in the way he held her afterward, as if it were not just survival anymore, but something closer to belonging. When the snow finally relented, they stepped outside into a world remade in white. The trees were bowed with frost, and not a single track marred the field beyond. Nora felt the silence settle in her chest, not heavy, but full. Like a page waiting for words. They walked together to the ridge, boots crunching in rhythm, breaths visible in the sharp light. He pointed out a fox's den, she a set of bird tracks etched like calligraphy in the crust. They stood a long while, side by side, watching the valley stretch wide and clean beneath the sky. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, voice soft as the wind. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Then I remember the coffee." She laughed, a sound rare and honest. "That all it takes?" "That and the chair," he said, "and the books, and your singing, and this." She looked up, met his gaze. There was nothing hurried in it, nothing urgent. Just the slow, steady truth of his presence. That night he kissed her for the first time, not out of need, out of knowing. It was not passion that lit the room, but something deeper, recognition, long and quiet. She leaned into him like the earth to the rain, and he held her with all the care of a man who'd once thought he'd forgotten how. There were no vows, no promises carved in stone. Just the smell of wood smoke, the warmth of another body, and the hush of snow falling soft beyond the window. Not forever, not yet, but they were closer than they'd ever dared to believe. January brought a stretch of brittle cold that turned breath to frost before it left the mouth. The snow hardened into sharp crusts that cracked underfoot, and the river froze solid enough to carry a man's weight. The forest stilled, the world narrowed. But inside the cabin, life moved in slow, steady warmth. They had slipped into a rhythm of wintering, Nora and Eli, with days marked not by clocks but by the rising and falling of the stove fire. She mended clothes near the hearth while he shaped new axe handles from spruce. Meals were simple, jerked meat, preserved beans, the last of the flour, but shared with quiet gratitude, each bite earned. Sometimes they sat close and did nothing at all, letting the silence speak for them. They learned each other's small griefs without telling. She noticed how he never faced the fire directly, always angled sideways, as if expecting something to strike from the dark. He saw the way she stiffened in sleep, the shallow breathing of someone who'd known too many nights without safety. They didn't talk about the past. They only built around it, like planting over old roots too deep to dig. One morning, a rifle shot split the dawn. Eli was out the door before she'd thrown back the quilt, boots unlaced and coat swinging. Nora followed, grabbing the small revolver from the shelf, heart hammering like hooves on stone. They found the man down by the riverbank, thin, staggering, blood on the snow. A stranger, barely more than a boy, with a mangled arm and eyes too wide for the cold. "Wolf," he gasped, before slumping into Eli's arms. They brought him in, laid him by the fire. Nora cut away the shredded coat while Eli cleaned the wound. It was bad, teeth marks deep and angry, fever already brewing. The boy trembled, muttered half-sentences about being left behind, about hunger, about a brother who'd run. They nursed him through the worst of it. Nora slept in Eli's arms those nights, waking to feed the fire, to cool the stranger's brow, to press water to cracked lips. The boy didn't speak for 2 days, then began to ask questions, each one sharp with suspicion. "You two married?" Eli looked to her. She only said no. The boy snorted. "Could have fooled me." When he was strong enough to walk, he limped to the porch and stared out at the trees like he expected them to speak. Nora offered him a wool coat. Eli handed him jerky and pointed toward the east ridge. Neither asked him to stay, neither asked why he'd come. He left without a goodbye, just a nod and a glance back at the cabin. That night, Nora sat long at the window, watching the stars come out in sharp, cold light. "Do you think he'll make it?" she asked. Eli didn't answer right away. "I don't know." They watched the moon rise. "You didn't ask me to stay either," he said finally. "You were never leaving," she replied. Spring came slow, as always. The snow softened in patches, the first blades of grass pressing through earth like tentative prayers. The creek broke open one morning, its ice groaning and giving way, and Nora stood at its edge listening to the water move again. They began clearing new ground behind the cabin, turning soil with aching backs and blistered hands. Eli suggested potatoes. She said beans. They planted both. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with longing, not even with need, but with a kind of steady awe, like a man watching fire take hold after a long winter of damp matches. She never asked what he saw. She only let him keep looking. One night, as they sat beneath the stars with their boots in the cool grass and the quiet stretching long between them, she reached over and took his hand. "Do you ever wish it had happened differently?" she asked. He thought on it a long while. "No," he said at last, "because it wouldn't be this." She nodded, feeling the truth settle low in her ribs, deeper than breath. They didn't believe in forever. Not then, but they believed in waking beside someone who knew your silences. They believed in firewood, in morning coffee, in another spring. They believed in the days that followed, not promised, but chosen. And sometimes, that was enough to build a life. By the time the wild roses bloomed along the fence line, Nora had forgotten the exact day she stopped waiting for something to go wrong. The fear still lived in her bones. It always would, but it no longer ruled her. She moved through each morning not with caution, but with care. Eli, still as steady as the mountains behind them, became not just a presence but a pattern. Boots beside hers, voice humming low as he mended tack or checked the traps. They'd begun building a root cellar come June. The cabin's old stone one had long since collapsed under a wet spring, so they picked a slope farther from the house, where drainage would hold. Eli dug while Nora reinforced the walls with split logs. They worked long into the golden hours, shirts damp with sweat, the scent of crushed grass and loamy earth rising around them like memory. He would look up sometimes, his eyes catching hers through the dust, and there would be a softness there that needed no words. She would nod, and they would return to work. Later, when the cellar door was hung and the floor tamped flat, she placed her hand against the beam and said, "This'll outlast us both." He smiled. "So will the chair." The words surprised her, not because they were sweet, but because they were true. That chair, tilted just slightly to one side, carved with his awkward, careful hands, had become part of the room, part of the story. So had the second cup, always waiting, so had the boots he now left by the hearth. She began to hum again while cooking. Little tunes her mother had once sung, nothing fancy. Eli listened with that same stillness he gave to the wind and the creek and the dawn. It wasn't worship, it was reverence. One evening in July, a letter arrived. The boy they'd taken in that winter, Wheeze, she'd finally coaxed his name from him, had sent it from Helena. Scribbled and misspelled, but full of thanks, said he'd found work with a teamster and was learning to shoe horses. "You and the man saved me," he'd written. "Ain't forgot it, won't." Nora read the letter, aloud by lantern light. Eli said nothing after, just took it and tucked it into the Bible she kept on the mantel, though neither of them read from it. She watched his hands and thought, this is what a vow looks like. That night they lay together with the window open, crickets humming like lullabies, the breeze warm and rich with sage. Nora turned toward him and spoke the thought she'd been holding like a stone in her chest. "I never believed in it." "Not forever." "I know," he said, "but this feels close." He shifted just enough to press his lips to her hair. "It is." In the fall, she found herself watching the sky more often, not with fear, but with wonder. The clouds rolled in like waves, the geese passed overhead in loose, longing lines. She canned tomatoes from a neighbor's late harvest and knit him a scarf, though he rarely felt the cold. He wore it anyway, said it kept the wind out of his collar. They had no paper marriage, no rings, no altar. But he began calling the cabin home when he rode to town. And she, when asked about her life, simply said, "We built it." Come winter, the storms returned. One caught them unprepared, early and fierce, the wind sharp as a blade. They spent the night huddled near the stove, the roof howling. In the morning they found the barn wall collapsed under a drift. The goats had survived, buried but breathing. Together they dug them out, hands raw and cheeks burning with cold, and Nora laughed, sudden and surprised. "You ever think we're just stubborn fools?" she asked, brushing snow from her sleeve. All the time, he said. She leaned into him, cheek against his shoulder. But we're still here. That night she lit a second lantern and read from a book with frayed edges and water-warped pages. He carved a sparrow from a piece of driftwood she'd found by the river. It was the finest thing he'd made, delicate, wings tucked close. She touched its tiny beak, heart rising in her throat. He looked up at her. I want to build you something permanent, he said. She took his hand. You already did. They didn't speak of forever. They never had to. It was in the way he filled the woodbox without asking. In the way she rose early to start the fire before his feet touched the floor. In the letters tucked in the Bible, in the rocking chair worn smooth by evenings shared. In the quiet years that followed, no one would ever say they lived without hardship. But they endured, and not just endured, they grew, into the place, into each other, into something that, for all its simple parts, became whole, forever didn't arrive with thunder or vows. It came in the shape of firewood stacked high, of morning coffee poured with steady hands, of two people who didn't need to be rescued, only seen. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.